Good day to you. Are you a person who would describe yourself as feeling anxious? Yeah, I have a lot of students who tell me they have anxiety. Well, I wonder if this chapter might speak to you. Yes, we are continuing a takedown of liberal capitalism in the class, and it continues to be a struggle for many of you, I hope, because you are studying the system that you're growing up in under a new way of looking at it, right? It doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything. Today we're talking about right-wing authoritarianism in the context of social media, for example. And if you consider yourself a conservative or a right-winger, that's perfectly acceptable. You do not have to agree with the ideas in this chapter. But the point of looking at social media critically is so that you examine the ideology of the system, which is not otherwise understandable unless you really criticize it. That's what we're doing. So this chapter that we're dealing with today is all about how right-wing authoritarianism is communicated on social media. And unlike some of the other instructor videos, I'm going to leave the back end of the chapter material for you to read because it is mostly about Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is an authoritarian figure on social media. And I don't want to ruffle any opinions about politics. That's not my point in this class. So you can read those ideas for yourself and you can decide whether you agree with them. But to get back to our task at hand, basically Fuchs' contention with this chapter is that neoliberal capitalism, remember that's a kind of capitalism that operates free from government interference. Neoliberal is about freedom from government. So freedom from government in and of itself is a way of setting up a political system in your country. But then when you combine it with capitalism, what Fuchs says is it has created inequalities across the world, leading to the rise of authoritarian groups, including on social media. He reminds us, Fuchs does, that the internet, it was supposed to be a politically progressive medium, a medium where all kinds of voices would be given new profiles in the total discourse of conversation it takes on, that the internet would be able to provide this and that politics could advance many things that are needed by society. However, that's not what's happened. So let's talk about what has happened. And the first thing we're going to talk about is nationalism and authoritarianism. Nationalism and authoritarianism, and there's a tag for this particular section that's also called neoliberalism's negative logic. Negative logic. What is negative logic? It's when something is designed to do something and then it ends up working against itself. So how is that going on social media? Well, first of all, what authoritarian capitalism does is it reduces society to the logic of profits. Again, we're returning to Marxian terms here, and the Frankfurt School, which followed up on Marx, and the Frankfurt School has many different thinkers that we're talking about today, like Adorno and Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School in Germany, continuing on with the critical analysis of communication. And the Frankfurt School and this line of thinking is repeatedly pointing out that neoliberalism combined with capitalism reduces the logic that we use in almost every dimensions of life to the logic of profit making. In addition, neoliberal nationalism and authoritarianism and how it creates neoliberalism's negative logic is it presents new threats to democracy, threats from authoritarian groups that we're going to describe in the instructor video today. And essentially what Fuchs is saying is that social freedom, the ability to truly think like you want and to say what you want and to move around as you want and conduct your life as you want, social freedom, is in conflict with market freedom. Market freedom is always trying to constrain your social freedom. And that's coming from Horkheimer and Adorno, two of the Frankfurt theorists that I talked about. Next up in our discussion is fascist social media. What is fascism? We use it a lot. Well, we use it sometimes. We use it when we describe people like Adolf Hitler. What is fascism? Fascism is where you have one leader who rules with an iron fist. They intimidate, they bully, they censor, they demonize other groups. That's the essence of fascism. So what is fascist social media? Well, Fuchs talks extensively about 4 terrorist incidents, one of them occurring in New Zealand. That's the first one he talked about, where the terrorists actually live stream on Facebook the killing of others. So the social media platform of Facebook, whether it was slow to react or not, is a good example of enabling authoritarianism, and in this case, the extreme form, fascism, on social media. Also in this particular section, the author talks about Trump's use of media. He talks about his tweets. I'll let you read about that, about the content of his tweets and what he says. And he actually makes comments that fit into Fuchs' definition. And Fuchs points out that social media are largely fascist because there is less of a presence of the political left on social media because of asymmetry that exists because of the capitalist logic. So next up in our discussion is the networked far right. And Fuchs made a very important observation here, which is kind of in front of us that I hadn't really thought about before. And that is most of our networking. You know what networking is? It's right. When you know a person, they know a person, they know a person. There's a hierarchy in there. Somebody may have a better job than you, more degrees. We always talk about networking when we want to get a job, right? I need to network. That's what you're told to do as a student so that you can meet somebody who may, just by that chance opportunity, want to hire you. Fuchs' point is that most of our networking today is done on the internet. It's not done in person. It's done on the internet, and most of that is in the context of social media. He talks about the author Manuel Castell's book called The Networks of Outrage and Hope. And that's what Castells is saying, that most networking is done on the internet. And Castells goes on to say that the far right movements are not really movements. The far right communication that you get on social media exists because of what he calls a lack of autonomous social movements. So in other words, what he's saying is authoritarianism, as it is presented in social media, is not actually a movement. It's a populist collection of opinions, but even that idea of populist collection is questioned by Fuchs. And so what Fuchs is getting to, and Castells, is that we need a democratic socialism to have a presence on social media instead. Socialism, not the classic definition that you think of, about government controlling people's lives. Nothing could be further from the truth in the countries that I've been to where there's social. I'm going to one this summer in Sweden. The government's not controlling people's lives there. Swedish people are very rich. A lot of them are entrepreneurs. A lot of them have a lot of material things. But what we're talking about instead is socialism as the antithesis of liberal capitalism, where the profit logic is all that is governing the logic that takes place in decision-making. Socialism, we're going to get into later on in the class, but that's what's missing. That's what's missing. Democratic socialism, a very different kind of socialism, democratic socialism. Next up is right-wing authoritarianism. We're going to talk about Erich Fromm's book here, and he talks about, Erich Fromm's work, I should say. He developed a description of what an authoritarian personality is, and he did this by studying Hitler, Adolf Hitler, who rose to power by promoting the economic inequalities that existed in Germany after World War II. He talked about the unfairness that existed, and that allowed him to galvanize public opinion because Germany was in a recession and a depression, which Fuchs point out is a crisis of capitalism. And you will see him talk more about that later on, that capitalism has recessions, it has depressions. You may think that's normal, right? Oh, it's all part of the business cycle. It's not. And so there was a crisis, a capitalistic crisis of the economy in Germany, and Adolf Hitler rose to power, and he also started to promote nationalism. So let's talk about these four dimensions that Fromm says make up an authoritarian leader. And that is, first of all, you have authoritarian leadership. That means one person in charge. And usually that person presents themselves as being the only one who can fix things, the only one who has access to the resources, the only one who has divine inspiration in some ways. That's what authoritarian leadership is. Secondly, as a dimension, is nationalism. Nationalism. That's where you describe your country not in a patriotic way, but you're taking it farther. You're starting to say that your country is better than other countries around the world. And we actually say that in our country unabashedly, right? We say the United States is the greatest country in the world. We say that all the time, but in Fuchs' view and mine, that's like saying, who's the best brother in your family? Who's the best? There is no best brother, but the U.S. may be really, really good at small business starts. That may be really good, but maybe not so good in poverty, because we have a lot of poverty in the United States. So saying the greatest country is an example of nationalism, a very mild level of it. When you trump up nationalism, and we can say that this is going on in Ukraine and Russia right now. It's a lot about national identity that's causing the war. That's a feature of authoritarianism. Next up is the friend/enemy schematic, Fuchs calls it, but it's really a friend-enemy dichotomy. And that basically says that everybody in your country is a friend and everybody outside is an enemy. And it's constantly dividing people into one of those two roles. You're either with us or against us. So that's another feature of authoritarian personality. And then finally, we have a military patriarchy. Military patriarchy, and that basically is saying that the ideal citizen of a country is a male soldier. That's a person who embodies everything about the values of what we would consider to be American. So that's the military part. The patriarchy part is that it is a male, not a female soldier, not a gay soldier, and that patriarchy extends to other dimensions of society where men, in our case, white men, are making most of the decisions and most of the values, and those are the voices that are being heard from the most. So because of this, Fromm and Fuchs say that right-wing authoritarianism is a class society. It's a class society. You're going to have differences you're going to have economic differences, you're going to have social status differences, you're going to have differences all through the line, and those differences are going to present barriers for people to communicate and to advance their lives. So now we're going to talk about 5 factors that are going on social media that are serving basically to promote and support right-wing authoritarianism on social media. The first one being the alienation of labor. The alienation of labor, which we've discussed at length in this class, of people working for free on social media, people typing stuff on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook every day, working for free, not getting a penny, and doing that and becoming, what, anxious? There's that word again. Anxious? Is that part of the reason? Because you're spending so much of your time doing something that's not really bringing any economic value to you, even though you're doing work and creating original content. It's kind of amazing. And then secondly, as a factor, we have anxiety. There we go, anxiety. And it's actually part of a complex of anxiety and persecutory anxiety. That's where you feel like somebody is after you, somebody is out to get you. So that's a second factor. And then we have destructive competition. Destructive competition is where you have competition, but it's not healthy. It's where your workers are eliminated from the equation. So Fuchs talks about some of the giant trade agreements that the United States has struck, NAFTA, which is no longer in effect, and others around the world, which has shipped jobs from the United States to other countries. That's usually a talk of authoritarianism and right-wing conservatism to hear that kind of talk, but Fuchs is using it to say that what has happened because of that is there's been destructive competition. It's put a lot of American workers out of jobs. Next up, we have social alienation. Social alienation. Social alienation is where people feel estranged from others. They have a hard time communicating. They want to stay in isolated environments by themselves, staring at their phone. We can see that with a bunch of people anywhere in public who are not talking with each other, even though they're standing next to each other, they're watching their phones. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the factors that bring together authoritarianism. And the right one, the last one, is 1, 2, 3 is I named them all. So no wait, the last one is political alienation. Sorry about that. Political alienation is where you hear people say, I don't vote, they're all crooked, right? All politicians are bad, right? Oh yeah, I didn't vote, I didn't get around to it, I didn't really know anything about the people running for office. I saw a couple ads, but why is that? People who are invested in politics, they educate themselves. They study things. They study bills. Have you ever read a single bill that the United States Congress has passed? I have. I read the infrastructure plan. I read the entire bill. Let me tell you, it's not fun. It's actually worse than reading a really heavy-duty college textbook, if you consider that to be a bad thing. It's very dry. But people don't invest like that. I'm not saying that I'm really politically active. I consider myself to be alienated as well. But That's one of the factors that allows authoritarianism to step into that void, right? And so what steps in usually, Fuchs said, is a kind of populism of authoritarianism. Or authoritarianism. So what happens is right-wing authoritarianism presents itself as being part of a populist movement. A populist movement is where you have the people's choice for a candidate. It's not the person who is endorsed by other politicians. It's not the person who's been in office for a long time. It's a person who has a groundswell of people at the grassroots that supports them. So, for example, in our country, we have both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Again, both white males, both part of the military patriarchy in Fuchs' point of view. They both have claims to being populist candidates, right? They didn't have, well, in the case of Bernie Sanders, he didn't have a lot of money. He took small donations for his campaign. But Donald Trump also has claimed populism because of a lot of people who have felt displaced by previous politicians and were not connected to, particularly American workers, blue-collar workers. And so Fuchs is really asking the question, are both of these populist movements, or are they really authoritarianism? The strong rule of hand. And so he says, yeah, they're actually authoritarianism when it comes to right-wing communication on social media because, first of all, the people who are part of the populist movement are ambiguously defined. We are told that the people support certain positions, political positions, certain policy on social media, but it's assumed that we know who the people are. The people are ambiguous. Are these really all the people, most of the people, etc.? Next up is you have nationalism and bigotry. Nationalism necessarily develops into bigotry. If you're seeing your country as intact, as special, and everybody around you is an enemy, then you're going to see people according to their ethnic differences, their gender differences, as being part of that equation. And so there's a bigotry that goes on with nationalism that makes populism not populism, but authoritarianism. Next up is the embracement of racism. And that's similar to the bigotry that I talked about. It's the dividing people into abilities based on their race. We can say that that has happened in the United States, whether you think it's systematic racism or not, but we can say that George Floyd, for example, is an example. George Floyd is talked about in this chapter. We can also say that the third wave of racism is taking place in the United States. If you look at how African American people were enslaved originally in the United States. I was just in South Carolina, which started it all, pretty much. And that's the first wave. And then we had the Civil War. And then a second wave started, and that was the lack of civil rights. African Americans having to drink from separate water fountains, ride on separate buses, stay separate schools. And then that was eradicated by law, at least in theory, with the civil rights movement. And then the third wave is incarceration of African Americans. If you look at the rates of incarceration of African Americans, they're much higher than how many African Americans we have in society, 12 to 14%. And so it's another way of pointing out systemic racism. Some people believe in it. It points to social media's role in the embracement of racism. Do you see any talk on social media about the inequities here? I mean, you might. Do you see much? Do you see as much as products being sold in your news feed? No. Next up is identification of left and right. So in the case of the left, you have asymmetrical presence on social media because the left is not going to be able to participate in the logic of commodities, the logic of profit. And so the left is not going to be having a high enough profile. But that's not the same as saying that the left has populist leaders like Bernie Sanders, whereas the right also has its populist leaders, because when we talk about the right, we're talking about how there is no populism. It's because what is portrayed as being for the people is not really for the people, and the populism is not based on the people's sentiments, it's based on a commodity logic. Then finally, we have downgrading international sovereignty. That's another point that Fuchs tries to make, the importance of the world coming together as opposed to dividing the world up into different countries and saying this is our place and only we're going to decide. And you can kind of say that that's what's happening in Ukraine. and the Soviet Union with regard to NATO. You can say a lot of the U.S. efforts right now are trying to build coalitions amongst the NATO countries to try and resist the Russian aggression. You can say that that is fitting in with the approach of international sovereignty, that countries are working together, and that is not happening under authoritarianism. Nationalism is what's happening. So right-wing social media presence is, according to Fuchs, is not populism, it's authoritarianism. All right, so that basically takes us to the rest of the chapter, which I want you to read, which is all about Donald Trump and his tweets and George Floyd. And actually, Donald Trump made a tweet about George Floyd, which the tweet was, it was a repeated tweet, and it had to do with if you're going to, what I have it here, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And then Trump repeated that, and that was repeated on social media, and then we have the death of George Floyd under a police officer's knee. So you can decide for yourself, once again, whether those events are accurately portrayed. But the point is what is on social media that is fitting into this. And it's the tweets, the Donald Trump tweets, Fuchs claims, which are authoritarian, which have created situations like the George Floyd murder. Again, you can decide for yourself. Tough subjects that we're taking on today. That's the point of the course. Have a great day.